Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
The Wolf Story, Part 8 of the Hunting the Wolfman Series, Mexico. The highway past Cimarron was slick with a thin layer of fresh snow. Julian lay in the small back seat of the pickup truck. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Cat reached back and felt his forehead. Hell, he's burning up, Jack. We should get him to the hospital. I know, but it would be a death sentence for him. He's killed an officer of the law and a nurse. They're not going to try very hard to keep him alive. And even if they do, he'll be in a federal prison for the rest of his life. They're not going to let us talk to him, not at the hospital and certainly not in prison. I really don't think he's going to make it, Cat. I think we should try to talk with him now while we can, he reasoned with her. Jack knew they'd be searching for Julian all along the route between Montrose and Telluride. He had let the local sheriff think he was taking Cat back to his ranch in Montana for a few weeks, just to keep her safe from her stalker. But he also knew that if they couldn't find Julian anywhere in western Colorado, well, they'd start looking for him in Montana. He was trying to formulate a plan. He didn't like that he was harboring a fugitive from the law, particularly one who had threatened his sister's life and killed an officer and a nurse and who knows what else. He was a dangerous man and a ruthless killer. But the man who lay in the back seat of the truck was clinging to life, and he didn't seem like much of a threat at the moment. Cat spoke up. Jack, what are we going to do? We can't get him back to Germany. He's a criminal. But he's also my father. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't mean much at this point, but I'd still like to get some answers from him. Well, Cat knew Jack was trying to formulate a plan in his head. He was quiet, and he had that determined look on his face that he got when he was deep in thought. Now, Cat wondered just what they had gotten themselves into. They turned off on the 149 heading toward Lake City. It was the long way to head towards New Mexico, but a much less traveled route. No one would be searching for the fugitive along this little stretch of highway. It was heavily forested with many switchbacks, and it was really slow traveling, but safe. Jack had decided the best thing he would do now would be to get him down to the border and into Mexico somehow, if he lived that long. Well, Jack tried to take the switchbacks as easy as he could. Occasionally, he'd hit a rough patch of road, and they'd hear a groan from the back seat. At least that meant he was still alive. Well, by the time they got to South Park, several hours later, Julian was beginning to stir. They stopped at a market for bandages, food, and gas, and Cat had a gun in her lap just in case she needed it while Jack was in the market. But Julian couldn't even attempt to sit up. Too weak. They stopped outside of town and poured some water in Julian's mouth. He could swallow, but he was too weak to say anything, while Cat wrapped fresh gauze bandages around his neck wound. It had bled quite a bit, but it looked clean. Well, Julian, for his part, he just closed his eyes and slept. It was well past dark by the time they reached Chama, New Mexico. They booked a cabin at the Elkhorn Lodge and carried Julian inside. It was just a private little cabin, secluded and safe. Jack cooked some ground beef, and Cat attempted to feed Julian a little of it. The meat, it seemed to revive him. He was able to sit up and drink some water, and even gave Cat a little smile and whispered thank you to her. The cabin had 2 beds and a pull-out sofa, but Jack didn't expect he'd sleep much anyway. As weak as Julian appeared to be, he still wasn't sure he could trust him. He told Cat to get some sleep, and he'd sit up and keep an eye on things. Jack watched the man sleep, pondering how their lives had been so disrupted by the last few years' events, starting with the cattle that were being attacked back in Montana, the death of Hannah and Gunther Yeager, It seemed like ages ago. And now to find out that Hannah was really Kat's mother. It just didn't seem possible. In an ironic way that was almost more difficult to believe than the fact that they were really werewolves, Jack chuckled to himself. And then they had hunted down Hans Jaeger in Washington, and now they find out it was Kat's brother. Things like this just didn't happen in real life. It was like waking up in a bad movie. Only these characters were real. He thought about how his parents had hidden this secret side of their lives so well. And once again, he wondered if his mother had also been a wolf. Had Dad known any of this? He was a conservative Montana cattleman, a cowboy. Jack couldn't picture his dad buying into any of this. It all seemed so unbelievable. He was living in a fairy tale of wolves and gypsies, and he still couldn't wrap his head around it. He missed his ranch. It had only been a couple of months since he'd been home, but it felt like it had been gone a couple of years. He knew his ranch manager was handling things pretty well back home. He didn't have to worry about that. No, he was worried that life would never go back to normal at this point. He watched Julian stir restlessly, murmuring something in his sleep. This man, Kat's father, was wanted for killing an officer. How in the hell was he going to get him back across the border? Let alone get him back to Germany. And should he? Well, part of him wanted to just turn the guy over to local authorities. Be done with him. Maybe they should just get some information from him, then drop him off at the local jail. He didn't think Kat would go for that. He thought he could understand the lack of reasoning that goes with being a predator under attack. An animal in the wild thinks only of itself. Killing is an instinctual necessity, a way for a species to survive. But did that make it right? Absolutely not. Not in this case, anyways. Julian stirred and opened his eyes. He seemed to be having trouble figuring out just where he was. He had a confused look in his eyes, and they settled on Jack sitting in the corner. He tried to lean up on an elbow and said something in a low whisper, but Jack couldn't make out what he said. He laid his head back on the pillow and closed his eyes, and within minutes he was back asleep. Jack dozed in his chair, ready to spring awake at the slightest sound, but the rest of the night was quiet. Well, Kat woke early and made coffee. She encouraged Jack to get some sleep. She'd stay up now and watch Julian. Jack handed her the gun and told her to wake him immediately if Julian stirred. He was grateful to get a few hours' sleep before they'd travel on towards Mexico. He still wasn't sure how they'd hide Julian from the border patrol and get him across the border, but it certainly should be easier to pass into Mexico than it was to cross the border from Mexico. But a few hours of sleep might be enough to clear his mind and help him find a solution. Now Jack woke to the smell of bacon and voices. Kat was sitting on the bed next to Julian, helping him eat bacon and scrambled eggs. Julian was sitting up in bed, pillows tucked up behind him. Jack shook his head at Kat. So much for waking him if Julian stirred. He was sitting up and eating and having a conversation with her. "What the hell?" Jack said. "I thought you were going to wake me up." Kat rolled her eyes and got up to pour him a cup of coffee. "We're fine. Julian's feeling better. He's very grateful that you're helping him. We've been talking about what his village is like in Germany." And 6 hours later, they were in Deming, New Mexico. They took a back road from there into Columbus on the border. It was pretty desolate. Columbus is a tiny town that sits right on the border where in 1916, Pancho Villa attacked a U.S. Army garrison, and General John Black Hawk Pershing and his troops spent 9 months chasing Villa through Mexico. It was twilight when they arrived, and across the broad sweep of the desert floor they could see the dark mass of the border fence, crowned by a chain of floodlights. The wall in this part was 18 to 20 foot high, designed to funnel people toward the port of entry or around it. A dirt road ran parallel to the fence and led to the port of entry in Antelope Wells, down in the state's Boot Heel region. The gate is closed at night, but even during the day, when only a few vehicles drive through, this is probably the loneliest border crossing in America. Of the 43 official ports of entry along the southern U.S. border, This one is the least used. Far ahead, a pair of headlights shone through the dark emptiness, headed straight towards them. Hell, it might be Border Patrol, Jack thought to himself, or it could be one of Miguel Flores's men. Jack hoped it was the latter. Miguel was an old acquaintance from Jack's rodeo days. He'd met him on the circuit and knew him as one of the best steer ropers and bull riders he'd ever known. Miguel owned a large horse ranch deep in the heart of Mexico. Calling him had been a shot in the dark, and renewing their acquaintance was risky for several reasons. But if anyone could get them across the border, it would be Miguel. Miguel had been involved in a few shady dealings back when Jack knew him as a young cowboy. Over the years since then, Miguel had managed to establish a prominent horse breeding operation in the United States that allowed he and his investors to launder millions of dollars in drug money. So Miguel had devised an elaborate scheme in which Mexican businessmen paid for horses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from their own bank accounts so the purchases would appear legitimate. And then the cartel would later reimburse the businessmen, and the horse's ownership would be transferred to Miguel. The operation amounted to a foothold in the United States for one of Mexico's most dangerous criminal networks. Miguel now had a slew of bodyguards and connections that rivaled that of the largest drug cartels in Mexico. He was a ruthless businessman and someone you did not want on your bad side. He had once dumped the bodies of 49 people, without heads, hands, or feet, in garbage bags along a busy highway in northern Mexico. Miguel's men knew most of the Border Patrol, and they knew who they could pay off and who they couldn't. When Jack called him, he sounded excited to help his old friend out and didn't ask any questions. Now, many years ago, when they were both in their early 20s and doing the rodeo circuit, Miguel had stolen Jack's girlfriend. Their friendship had ended in a fist fight, and Jack hadn't talked to Miguel in all these years, but now all it took was one phone call to renew the friendship. The white pickup truck screeched to a stop with a billowing cloud of dust. Miguel himself stepped out with a big smile on his face. "Jack Moore, it's damn good to see you. And who's this pretty girl you got here with you? Is that little Cat? Where's her pigtails?" He wrapped Cat in a big bear hug and stood back and smiled at them both. "Let's get you out of here. We've got the entry port taken care of, and we can drive straight through. Just follow me." Jack smiled at Cat. See? Those years of rodeoing finally paid off. Cat let out a big sigh. "I hope this isn't a mistake," she said. "I'm afraid this could get us all killed." Jack gunned the pickup, following the cloud of dust ahead of him. They drove through the night at heart-racing speeds, through the desert and into the mountains. Hairpin turns were taken on two wheels, it seemed to Jack. Cat, she just closed her eyes and held on for dear life. And Julian lay in the back seat groaning at every bump in the road. Miguel, he was used to these roads. Jack was not. It was morning when they arrived at Miguel's ranch, and the roosters were strutting around the circular drive at the front of the hacienda. They squawked and fluttered away as the trucks came to a screeching halt. Miguel jumped out and yelled, "Welcome, amigos," with a huge smile on his face. Jack and Cat stepped out of the pickup on shaky legs. "You look a little green in the face, Catarina," he laughed. Well, Rancho del Sol was a spacious estate with green lawns, exotic trees, and flowering bushes, surrounding a beautiful hacienda with courtyards, fountains, sprawling horse barns, and lush pastures of green. It was the most beautiful and luxurious horse ranch Jack had ever seen. He remembered Miguel as a girl-crazy romantic fool in his early 20s. Since then, he'd had more wives than most men have girlfriends. Looks like he'd done pretty good for himself, Jack thought. Coming down the steps to greet them was a beautiful Mexican woman, wearing a brightly colored skirt and blouse. Her dark hair was pulled into a plaited braid which hung over her shoulder in a long twist. She was Juanita, the sister of Miguel Flores. Jack remembered her as a pretty young teenager that turned all the boys' heads. Now she was every bit as gorgeous. She walked up to Jack and planted a big old kiss on his cheek. He blushed and he removed his cowboy hat. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, dipping his head in a respectful nod. She laughed and slugged him in the shoulder. Miguel walked over to the truck. So tell me what this contraband is you've smuggled into my country. The kitchen cook, Rosa, had spread out a huge breakfast on the outdoor patio. Huevos rancheros with homemade tortillas, hot coffee, freshly squeezed orange juice, and a shot of tequila waited each of the guests and family members. Julian managed to sit at the table and eat a little bit of this food. And after breakfast, they were shown to their rooms and collapsed in their beds. It was expected that they would all join Miguel later for dinner, but until then, it was time to rest. Julian was given a room of his own with a guard outside his door as Jack requested. Miguel didn't question him. It was a common request in his line of work. For the next several days, Juanita took personal care of Julian's wounds. She took him under her wing and tended to him like an injured bird. It was hard to believe that he was the same man who had kidnapped Kat and attacked Jack. He strode around the hacienda like one of the roosters, Juanita holding his arm and encouraging him to lean on her for balance. Miguel and Jack inspected the horses. Miguel's pride bursting with every compliment from Jack. He loved his prize horses and didn't get to show them off very often. Kat was happily sketching her surroundings, already planning a future art installation based on the colorful art of Mexico. It was easy to forget that a manhunt was being led back in Colorado. The sheriff would soon be wondering where Jack and Kat had disappeared to. Jack's concocted story of taking Kat to his ranch in Montana to protect her while the stalker and cop killer was on the loose was only going to buy him a little bit of time. It wouldn't take long for them to be suspects in Julian's disappearance. Miguel knew Jack was hiding something. He hadn't become a successful businessman and drug lord by taking a man at his word. He knew when he was being lied to, but he also sensed that Jack was in some trouble and needed his help. The bond of friendship was as strong as the bond of family in Miguel's mind. In his line of work, he had few friends and even fewer that he could trust. He was willing to help Jack, no matter what the real story was. Miguel was a bit concerned that his sister Juanita had taken such a liking to Julian. He was a bit older than she was, but there was a wildness about him, a feral look that he knew his sister couldn't resist. You see, she was wild too, always had been. She'd never settled for a man, but had taken many lovers. He'd just never seen her to take to someone like this, though. It made him wonder if maybe she'd met her match this time. Or it could be just a passing fancy. She certainly had those. Whatever it was, he liked seeing her flit about the house like a new bride. Miguel watched as Julian and Juanita strode through the garden arm in arm. Juanita didn't leave his side, but now that Julian was healing and able to talk in more than just a whisper, it was time to get some answers from him and from Jack. The golden light of dusk settled on the trees and the bats were swooping around overhead. Miguel started a fire in the large outdoor fire pit and pulled up a couple of chairs. He opened a bottle of his finest tequila to loosen the tongues and let the story begin. Julian and Juanita sat on a bench side by side, her arm tucked into his. Kat, Jack, and Miguel sat in cushioned iron chairs gazing at the fire. Several yards away, the armed men Miguel hired to guard his property, they were all busy patrolling the grounds. It was peaceful, and Miguel was ready to start asking questions. Jack, you need my help, and you know I won't deny you that. But I need to know what the hell's going on here. Why, after all these years, you're here at my house, and don't tell me it's because you needed a vacation. Well, Jack looked at Kat. For the first time, he felt he could tell the whole story. Maybe it was the tequila, but for some reason he felt he could trust Miguel with the truth. Kat nodded to him. She felt the same way, and she hoped Julian would be able to fill in the missing pieces. It was another sleepless night. They finished that bottle of tequila and opened another as the story continued to pour forth. Miguel felt bonded to Jack like a brother now that he knew what Jack had gone through the past few years. Parts of his story sounded like fiction, but in Mexico, mystery was a way of life. Jack's story began with the Yeager's transformation, their son they hunted down in Washington, his friends Parker and Doc who had died, the trip to Germany to find a cure, the discovery that Kat was really Hannah and Julian's daughter, and now here they were, smuggling a criminal across the border into Mexico. Julian didn't seem particularly interested until Jack mentioned seeking out Professor Luther in Germany to try to get a cure. He glanced up with a look of concern at the mention of that name. Once Jack had finished his story, they all looked at Julian. "Your turn," Jack said. Julian began his story. "My mother's name is Grace. She ran away from home at the age of 15 because she had fallen in love with a gypsy named Sergio. She was wed in a gypsy ceremony around a campfire when she turned 16. Grace and Sergio were happy until the war came. German soldiers were rounding up gypsies and sending them to concentration camps. Gypsies were considered less than human, and being of gypsy blood was a death sentence. Several members of their village bore the mark of the wolf, so it was decided amongst the community that every man and woman would be bitten so they could protect themselves in the village by turning into wolves when the soldiers came to take them. Some were not able to stand the transformation and they died, but those who did transform fought as best as they could. But they were outnumbered. Many were killed and many more were captured and taken to concentration camps where they were forced to endure terrible medical experiments. Hitler became obsessed with the idea of creating an army of werewolves by using gypsies' blood to create a serum which could be injected into his soldiers. He called himself the Wolf, and his special forces teams were known as the werewolves. It was a Nazi plan to create a resistance force that would operate behind enemy lines. In the fall of 1944, Heinrich Himmler initiated Operation Werewolf and began organizing an elite troop of volunteer forces. Extensive medical experiments were done on the captured gypsies. Those that had the right blood sequence had their blood literally drained from them and replaced with a saline solution. Most of these unfortunate men, women, and children, they died. My mother was one of the few that survived. My father Sergio had bitten my mother and taught her how to transform at will. That is what saved her life. She was kept bound in a cage and experimented upon. Soldiers were brought to her and she was forced to bite them. They would then be tested to see if her wolf blood mixed with their blood and if they were able to transform into wolves. After the war ended in 1945, someone eventually freed her. She made her way back home, only to find that most of the village was gone. Her husband Sergio had escaped confinement and was leading a band of rogue gypsies in the Harz Mountains. Word got to him that Grace was still alive and they were once again reunited. Several years later, we were born. "We?" Kat interjected. "I have a twin brother named Mikhail. Our people were still suffering from the discriminations of the war. We were gypsies, which meant we were not welcome in common society. You can imagine what that must have been like as we grew into our teenage years. We didn't understand why people hated us, why we weren't allowed to go into town and socialize with other kids our age. We were confined to our little village, but we would sneak into the nearby towns to watch the people and try to fit in. We learned to steal what we could not have. I first saw Hannah as she was hanging clothes on a line outside of her home. I thought she was the prettiest girl I had ever seen. I remember that day so well. It was late August and the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and matched her beautiful golden hair. But I was shy and I was afraid to approach her. I started hanging around the edge of the forest near her home, watching her from a distance. There was a large rock where her fence met the forest's edge, and I started leaving her little gifts there. Flowers, trinkets, gypsy jewelry. I'd watch as she'd wander over to check the rock and smile when she found what I had left her. She started leaving me little baked goods, cupcakes and muffins and delicacies wrapped in a pretty cloth. It wasn't long before we were leaving little love notes for each other. By early winter, we were sneaking away into the forest, cuddled under a blanket around a campfire. We spent every moment that we could steal in each other's arms, until the day her husband discovered us. He had followed her tracks in the snow and found us lying in each other's arms, cuddled between blankets next to the fire. We fought, but Gunther had a gun and shot me, leaving me to bleed to death in the snow. My brother Mikhail found me and carried me back to our village. It was weeks before I was strong enough to stand. I'd lost a lot of blood. I asked my brother if he had seen Hannah, and he told me she was gone, that she had run away. One of the servant girls had told him that Hannah thought I was dead and that she was pregnant with my child. The servant girl helped Hannah escape and go aboard a ship for the United States where her sister lived. She didn't know where. She said Gunther was trying to find her. Mikhail told the servant girl that if she should hear from Hannah to let her know that I was alive and that I would come for her. It was over a year later I received a letter from Hannah. She had given birth to a little dark-haired girl named Catherine, and she gave our daughter to Rose to protect her. She told me Gunther had found her and they were going to stay in America and not to look for her. She told me she did not love me and to stay away. I could never forgive her for that. I could have protected her. Our village would have protected her. I was angry and I felt betrayed. And now it's taken me all these years to find you, Catherine. Well, the fire had burnt down to embers and the second bottle of tequila was nearly spent. It had been a long night. More of the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was still the future to decide. What role did Cat play in all this? What were they going to do with Julian? And why did Julian flinch when Professor Luther's name was mentioned? And who had given Jack the envelope of photographs, and why? Miguel got up and yawned loudly. Amigos, I think we need to sleep. But tomorrow night, we will continue our story. I want to tell you about my Mexican ancestors, the nahual. I think you'll find that my story is connected to yours in a very interesting